She told me not to start anything that night at the gallery opening, so I didn't. I just finished everything instead. That evening was supposed to celebrate my promotion to lead architect at Morrison & Associates, a milestone I'd been working toward for 3 years of designing everything from community centers to luxury residential towers. Amanda had insisted we attend this upscale art gallery opening in the theater district, claiming it would be perfect for networking with all the city's creative professionals and celebrating my achievement in style. I'd been genuinely looking forward to sharing this moment with someone who supposedly cared about my career, finally having something concrete to show for the 70-hour weeks I'd been putting in on the new cultural center downtown that was already generating buzz in architectural circles. Amanda looked absolutely stunning in her black cocktail dress, the designer piece I'd bought her for our 2-year anniversary, and I felt a surge of pride walking into that sophisticated crowd with her on my arm, thinking this was exactly the kind of evening successful couples should be having together. The gallery itself was impressive, soaring ceilings, polished concrete floors, and dramatic lighting that showcased both the permanent collection and the evening's featured exhibition beautifully, creating the perfect backdrop for the city's cultural elite to gather and appreciate art while discussing their latest projects. The space was buzzing with architects, artists, city planners, and gallery patrons I'd only met at professional conferences, and I was genuinely excited to introduce Amanda to my colleagues while celebrating this career breakthrough that represented years of dedication and sacrifice. Amanda seemed to be enjoying herself initially, complimenting the gallery's design and asking intelligent questions about the architectural features I pointed out, making me think we were finally having the kind of sophisticated evening that matched our professional aspirations. But everything changed dramatically within 20 minutes of arriving when we encountered Kyle near the contemporary sculpture display, Amanda's ex-boyfriend who happened to be the featured photographer for the evening's exhibition of urban landscape photography. He was exactly what you'd expect from Amanda's dating history: tall, effortlessly charismatic, wearing an expensive leather jacket over designer jeans and talking loudly about his latest project documenting street art in Barcelona, completely commanding the attention of everyone around him with that natural confidence I'd never quite mastered despite my professional success. Kyle had the kind of artistic magnetism that drew people into his orbit without effort, and I watched several women hang on his every word as he described traveling through Europe capturing authentic urban culture for his upcoming coffee table book. The moment Kyle spotted Amanda across the gallery, his entire demeanor shifted into what I can only describe as full predator mode, immediately excusing himself from his admirers to approach us with a broad smile that didn't quite reach his calculating eyes. He greeted Amanda with an intimate familiarity that made my stomach drop, kissing both her cheeks in that pretentious European style while completely dismissing me with the briefest possible handshake and a disinterested glance at my business card when I mentioned my recent promotion. Kyle immediately began complimenting Amanda's appearance with the kind of specific observations that suggested he knew her body intimately, commenting on how the dress brought out her eyes and asking about her life with a casual possessiveness that completely ignored my presence beside her. I watched in growing disbelief as Amanda transformed before my eyes, becoming animated and flirtatious in a way I hadn't seen in months, laughing at Kyle's travel stories and touching his arm while completely forgetting I existed just inches away from her. She hung on his every word as he described photographing underground artists in Prague and Barcelona, her eyes lighting up with genuine excitement that I realized she'd never shown for any of my architectural achievements, no matter how significant they were to my career or our future together. When I attempted to interject with a comment about my promotion and the cultural center project I was leading, Kyle barely acknowledged my words before smoothly steering the conversation back to his photography and their shared memories of art gallery openings they'd attended together during their relationship. I felt like an unwelcome third wheel at my own celebration, watching helplessly as Kyle regaled Amanda with stories about exclusive gallery events and artist parties I'd never been invited to, creating an intimate bubble that deliberately excluded me from their conversation. The final breaking point came when Amanda turned to me with cold, almost annoyed eyes and told me firmly that I shouldn't start anything tonight, emphasizing that this was neither the time nor the place for jealousy or possessiveness, before announcing that she and Kyle needed to have a private conversation in the sculpture garden to catch up properly on everything that had happened since their breakup. She instructed me to go mingle with my architect friends and enjoy the exhibition on my own, promising she'd find me later after they finished their conversation, essentially dismissing me like an annoying child while she prepared to disappear into the gallery's outdoor space with her charming ex-boyfriend. I stood there in stunned silence as they walked away together toward the sculpture garden, Amanda's hand resting possessively on Kyle's arm while he guided her toward the secluded outdoor seating area among the contemporary art installations. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows that lined the gallery's back wall, I had a perfect view of the sculpture garden where Amanda and Kyle found an intimate bench surrounded by abstract metal sculptures, their conversation immediately becoming animated and personal in a way that made my chest tighten with a mixture of anger and humiliation. Standing alone in that crowded gallery, nursing a glass of overpriced wine while making awkward small talk with colleagues who kept asking where my girlfriend had gone, I realized with crystal clarity that I'd been reduced to nothing more than a convenient accessory in Amanda's life, someone she could bring to professional events when it suited her image but discard without hesitation the moment something more interesting or exciting appeared. I watched them through those windows for over an hour, their body language growing increasingly familiar and intimate, while I forced myself to discuss architectural trends and zoning regulations with people who obviously pitied my situation but were too polite to comment on my girlfriend's appalling behavior. Instead of waiting around to be humiliated further, I made a decision that would change everything. I was leaving, but not just the gallery. I quietly excused myself from a conversation about sustainable building materials with two senior partners from competing firms, retrieved my coat from the check without drawing attention to my departure, and walked out of that gallery with a calm determination I hadn't felt in months, knowing exactly what I needed to do while Amanda continued her intimate reunion with Kyle in the sculpture garden. The cool evening air felt refreshing after the stifling atmosphere inside the gallery, and as I walked to my car, I felt a strange sense of clarity about what tonight's events really meant for our relationship and my future happiness. The 20-minute drive to our shared downtown loft gave me time to think systematically about what had just happened and what it represented about our entire relationship dynamic, helping me realize that tonight's public dismissal was simply the final confirmation of a pattern of disrespect and emotional manipulation I'd been ignoring for far too long. Amanda had made her priorities crystal clear by choosing Kyle's attention over my career milestone, treating my promotion celebration like an inconvenient obligation while lighting up with genuine excitement for her ex-boyfriend's photography stories and travel adventures. I was done being treated like a convenient placeholder in her life, someone she could rely on for financial stability and emotional support while she pursued whatever excited her more at any given moment, whether that was Kyle's artistic lifestyle or any other distraction that made her feel more alive than our relationship apparently did. I parked in our building's underground garage and took the elevator up to our 15th floor loft with a strange sense of liberation, knowing I had at least 3 hours before Amanda would return home, assuming she even bothered coming back tonight instead of continuing her reunion with the charming photographer who'd already proven once that he wasn't interested in anything serious or long-term with her. Our loft was exactly the kind of space young professionals aspired to live in when they finally started making real money: exposed brick walls that gave it character, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline that made every sunset spectacular, an open kitchen with granite countertops and stainless steel appliances, and enough space for both my drafting table where I worked on evening projects and Amanda's photography equipment that she rarely used anymore despite constantly talking about her artistic ambitions. The rent was $3,200 monthly for this prime downtown location, and I'd been covering 80% of that cost since we'd moved in together 8 months ago, along with utilities, high-speed internet for my work needs, groceries, and most of our entertainment expenses, basically subsidizing Amanda's entire lifestyle while she worked part-time at an upscale art supply store and claimed to be building her portfolio as a freelance photographer. Standing in our living room surrounded by the life we'd supposedly been building together, I began the most methodical and thorough packing operation of my entire life, starting with my professional materials that were scattered throughout the apartment from months of working late into the evenings on various architectural projects that required absolute precision and attention to detail. I carefully packed my drafting equipment, including the professional-grade tools that had cost me over $1,000, my architectural software licenses, extensive reference book collection covering everything from sustainable design to historical architecture, and the expensive ergonomic desk chair I'd bought specifically for long design sessions that often stretched past midnight when deadlines were approaching. My technology setup was equally important to pack properly: laptop, dual external monitors for detailed CAD work, the high-end printer I used for creating building plans and presentation materials, external hard drives containing years of architectural projects, and the specialized drawing tablet that allowed me to create digital sketches with the precision my clients demanded for their custom designs. Every piece of furniture I'd purchased over the past year went into my mental inventory list as I moved through our space. The genuine leather sofa that had cost me 3 months of savings, the solid wood dining room table with matching chairs that Amanda had chosen but I'd paid for, the bedroom dresser where I kept my professional clothes, and the expensive memory foam mattress Amanda had insisted we needed for better sleep quality because she claimed our old mattress was affecting her back and preventing her from getting the rest she needed for her creative work. I moved through the apartment systematically and efficiently, packing clothes, electronics, books, personal documents, and sentimental items while making sure to cancel or transfer anything in my name that Amanda had been benefiting from without contributing to financially or even acknowledging the sacrifice I was making to maintain our lifestyle. I logged into all our shared streaming accounts and removed my credit card information from Netflix, Spotify, Hulu, and the premium HBO package Amanda watched religiously, canceled the expensive cable package I'd been paying for that included all the premium channels she used to watch foreign films and documentaries, and even carefully packed up the smart home devices I'd installed throughout the apartment over the past year to make our life more convenient and efficient. These included the voice assistant speakers in every room, the smart thermostat that learned our schedules and preferences, the security cameras I'd installed to monitor our supposedly happy home when we were both away at work, and the automated lighting system that Amanda had initially thought was romantic but had stopped appreciating months ago when everything I did became mundane rather than thoughtful in her eyes. The packing process took nearly 3 hours of focused work, during which I made multiple trips using the freight elevator to load my car with boxes and furniture, carefully timing these trips to avoid awkward conversations with neighbors who might ask questions about my sudden departure from what everyone in our building assumed was a stable, successful relationship between two young professionals. I organized the remaining space meticulously, arranging Amanda's belongings into neat piles and making it absolutely clear which items belonged to her versus what I was taking, ensuring she wouldn't be able to claim later that I'd stolen anything or left her completely unprepared for the financial reality of maintaining this expensive lifestyle on her part-time retail income. As I packed Amanda's photography equipment and art supplies into organized stacks, I discovered something hidden in her nightstand drawer that confirmed my decision to leave was absolutely the right choice: a leather-bound journal Amanda had been keeping for months that I'd never known existed, despite thinking we were completely honest and transparent with each other about our thoughts and feelings. Curiosity and a need to understand what had really been happening in our relationship got the better of me, and what I found inside those carefully written pages revealed months of systematic emotional infidelity that went far beyond tonight's gallery encounter with Kyle, showing a pattern of deception and fantasy that explains so much about Amanda's recent behavior and attitude toward our future together. Entry after entry, dated meticulously over the past 4 months, detailed her ongoing social media conversations with Kyle through Instagram direct messages, their secret phone calls when I was at work focusing on deadlines and client presentations, and her growing dissatisfaction with what she repeatedly called my boring stability compared to Kyle's exciting artistic lifestyle that offered the adventure and spontaneity she felt was missing from our predictable domestic routine. She'd written extensively and analytically about feeling trapped in what she described as our suffocating relationship, comparing Kyle's travel stories from photographing street art across Europe to my steady career advancement and financial security, ultimately concluding that she'd made a mistake by settling for safety and reliability when what she really wanted was passion and creative excitement that I apparently couldn't provide despite my own artistic sensibilities as an architect. The journal entries became increasingly critical and resentful of me over the past 3 months, describing my dedication to my architectural work as obsessive and selfish, my careful financial planning and budgeting as controlling and limiting her freedom, and my desire to build a stable future together as suffocating her artistic spirit and preventing her from pursuing the kind of bohemian creative lifestyle she'd always dreamed of living but had never actually worked toward achieving. Amanda had been systematically devaluing our relationship while building up Kyle as this perfect alternative who understood her creative soul in ways I never could, despite the fact that Kyle had broken up with her 2 years ago specifically because he wasn't ready for commitment and wanted to focus on his photography career without being tied down to any serious relationship, choosing his artistic freedom over any meaningful partnership with her. Reading those pages felt like discovering that our entire relationship had been a lie, that while I'd been working overtime to build a future for us, Amanda had been fantasizing about escaping to a more exciting life with someone who'd already proven he wasn't interested in anything long-term or meaningful with her, someone who saw her as a temporary distraction rather than a life partner. I photographed several key pages with my phone, not for any vindictive purpose but simply to remind myself later that my decision to leave wasn't an overreaction to one bad evening but a rational response to months of emotional betrayal and disrespect that I'd been too trusting to notice or confront directly. By the time I finished packing and cleaning up, our loft looked completely different, still furnished with Amanda's things, but clearly missing the masculine touches and expensive items that had made it feel like a shared home rather than just another bachelorette apartment that someone was struggling to afford on a part-time retail salary. I left a single note on our kitchen counter, positioned exactly where Amanda would see it when she walked through the door, echoing her own words from the gallery with surgical precision that I knew would cut deep. The message was brief but devastatingly clear, written in my neat architectural handwriting on expensive stationery that she'd given me for my birthday, creating an ironic touch that wasn't lost on me as I crafted my final communication as her boyfriend. I wrote simply, "Didn't start anything tonight, just finished it forever," and signed it with just my initial, knowing she'd understand immediately that her own dismissive words had been turned back on her with the kind of calculated precision she'd never expected from someone she considered predictable and boring. After placing the note where she couldn't miss it, I took one last look around the loft that had represented our shared dreams and aspirations, feeling surprisingly peaceful about walking away from a life that had never really been as mutual or meaningful as I'd believed it to be. I checked into the boutique Meridian Hotel across town, a sophisticated property I'd always admired but never splurged on, deciding that if I was going to start over completely, I might as well do it somewhere that reflected the kind of lifestyle I could actually afford without supporting someone else's expensive tastes and unrealistic expectations. The hotel room was elegant and minimalist, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a different perspective of the city skyline, and as I unpacked a few essential items, I felt a sense of freedom I hadn't experienced since before Amanda and I had moved in together and my life had become consumed by managing her emotions and financing her dreams. My phone started buzzing around 11:30 that night, exactly when I'd calculated Amanda would return home from her extended reunion with Kyle, assuming she hadn't decided to extend their evening even further with activities I preferred not to imagine. The first call came at 11:43 p.m., followed immediately by a second attempt when I didn't answer, then a third call that I watched ring through to voicemail while I sat in my hotel room feeling surprisingly calm about the chaos that was undoubtedly unfolding in our former shared space. I let every call go to voicemail, curious to track Amanda's emotional journey through her increasingly frantic messages as she discovered the reality of what I'd done and the implications for her comfortable lifestyle that had depended entirely on my financial support and emotional stability. The first voicemail was confused rather than panicked, with Amanda asking where I was and why some of our furniture was missing, clearly not yet grasping the full scope of my departure or the permanence of what had happened between us. Her voice still carried traces of the animated excitement she'd displayed while talking to Kyle, suggesting she was still riding the high of their reunion and hadn't yet processed that there might be consequences for her behavior at the gallery. The second message showed dawning awareness as she began noticing more missing items and finding the note I'd left, her voice becoming sharper and more demanding as she insisted I call her back immediately to explain what I thought I was doing and where I'd taken our shared belongings. By the third voicemail, recorded just 20 minutes later, panic had fully set in as Amanda realized the streaming services weren't working, the smart home devices were gone, and the scope of my departure was far more comprehensive than she'd initially understood. Her voice cracked as she demanded to know how I could just disappear like this without any discussion or warning, conveniently forgetting that she'd spent the entire evening ignoring me while pursuing her ex-boyfriend in front of my colleagues and friends. The fourth message revealed the full emotional breakdown as Amanda discovered that I'd canceled services, removed my financial support, and essentially stripped away the infrastructure that had been maintaining her lifestyle without her ever having to think about the practical details or costs involved. She was crying openly now, alternating between anger and desperation as she begged me to come home so we could talk about whatever was bothering me, as if my departure was just some minor relationship disagreement rather than a direct response to months of emotional betrayal and public humiliation. The messages continued throughout the night, each one revealing another layer of Amanda's growing desperation as she began calling mutual friends, trying to track down where I might have gone and whether anyone knew about my plans to leave her. I learned through her voicemails that she'd first called her sister, then her best friend Ashley, then even my colleague Marcus from the architecture firm, all of whom apparently had no idea where I was or what had precipitated my sudden departure from what everyone assumed was a stable relationship. The most revealing message came around 2 in the morning, when Amanda's voice was hoarse from crying and exhaustion, and she admitted that Kyle had left the gallery shortly after I did, claiming he needed to get back to his hotel because he had an early morning flight to his next photography assignment. She sobbed as she explained that Kyle had seemed distant and distracted during their conversation, checking his phone constantly and cutting their reunion shorter than she'd hoped, leaving her feeling confused and disappointed about their connection after building it up so much in her mind. The final twist of irony came in her last voicemail of the night, when Amanda revealed through her tears that Kyle had already posted Instagram stories from some trendy downtown bar where he was drinking with a beautiful woman she didn't recognize, someone who was clearly not interested in just talking about old times but was actively participating in whatever adventure Kyle was pursuing for the evening. She'd been replaced immediately and effortlessly by someone who represented exactly the kind of spontaneous excitement she thought she wanted, while I had simply removed myself from the equation entirely rather than competing for attention I deserved to have freely. Amanda's sister Rachel called me the next morning while I was having coffee in the hotel's elegant lobby, her voice sharp with accusation and barely controlled anger as she launched into a tirade about how I'd abandoned her sister without warning or explanation. Rachel had always been protective of Amanda, often enabling her worst impulses by making excuses for behavior that would be unacceptable from anyone else, and I could hear Amanda crying dramatically in the background while Rachel delivered what was clearly a rehearsed speech about my supposed cruelty and abandonment. She accused me of being vindictive and heartless for leaving without giving Amanda a chance to explain or apologize, completely ignoring the months of emotional neglect and the public humiliation I'd endured at the gallery opening just 12 hours earlier. I listened calmly to Rachel's accusations while watching well-dressed business professionals discuss their morning meetings around me, feeling remarkably detached from the drama that Amanda was orchestrating through her family members rather than taking responsibility for her own choices and their consequences. When Rachel finally paused for breath, I explained quietly that Amanda had made her priorities crystal clear by abandoning me at my own promotion celebration to pursue her ex-boyfriend, and that I'd simply responded by making my own priorities equally clear through my actions rather than empty words or ultimatums. I told Rachel about discovering the journal entries documenting months of emotional infidelity, about Amanda's systematic devaluation of our relationship while fantasizing about Kyle, and about the pattern of financial dependence that had turned me into a provider rather than a partner in Amanda's eyes. Rachel's tone shifted noticeably when I calmly outlined the financial reality of Amanda's situation, explaining that I'd been covering 80% of their expensive downtown loft rent along with utilities, groceries, streaming services, and most entertainment expenses while Amanda worked part-time and contributed virtually nothing to our shared life beyond her physical presence. I detailed how Amanda would need to find a way to cover $2,500 in monthly expenses on her retail salary of roughly $800 after taxes, assuming she could even find a roommate willing to split the lease on such short notice. The mathematics of Amanda's financial dependence became starkly clear as I explained to Rachel that her sister had been living a lifestyle completely unsustainable on her own income, relying entirely on my architect's salary to maintain the upscale apartment, expensive dinners, designer clothes, and entertainment that had become her normal expectations rather than appreciated luxuries. Rachel's defensive anger gradually transformed into worried silence as she began understanding the practical implications of my departure for Amanda's immediate survival, realizing that her sister's romantic drama had suddenly become a serious financial crisis that would require immediate action and significant lifestyle adjustments. Meanwhile, according to the mutual friends who started reaching out throughout the day, Kyle had completely vanished from Amanda's life as quickly as he'd reappeared, having apparently used their gallery reunion as nothing more than an ego boost and validation that he could still capture her attention whenever he chose to make the effort. Several people mentioned seeing Kyle's social media posts from his flight to Los Angeles that morning, where he was apparently meeting with gallery owners about his next photography exhibition, having already moved on to whatever opportunity or adventure had captured his interest while Amanda dealt with the wreckage of the choices she'd made the night before. The irony was devastating in its completeness. Amanda had sacrificed a stable, loving relationship for the fantasy of excitement and passion with someone who'd viewed her as nothing more than a temporary distraction, someone who'd never had any intention of offering her the meaningful partnership she'd thrown away so carelessly. Kyle's immediate departure left Amanda facing not only the emotional devastation of realizing she'd been used, but also the practical reality of trying to maintain an expensive lifestyle without the financial foundation I'd been providing for months while she pursued her creative dreams and part-time work schedule. By afternoon, I learned through our mutual friend network that Amanda was making increasingly desperate attempts to contact Kyle, calling his hotel only to discover he'd checked out early that morning, sending Instagram messages that were being left on read, and even trying to reach him through other photographers in his professional circle who had no interest in getting involved in personal drama. Her desperation was becoming public knowledge as she posted cryptic social media messages about betrayal and disappointment, clearly hoping Kyle would see them and respond with some kind of explanation or reassurance that their connection had been real rather than just opportunistic manipulation of her lingering feelings. The financial reality hit Amanda with brutal swiftness as she began calling landlords about breaking the lease early, only to discover that terminating their agreement would require paying a penalty equal to 3 months' rent plus losing the substantial security deposit I'd provided when we'd first moved in together. The upscale furniture she'd insisted we needed, the designer wardrobe she'd accumulated, and the art pieces she'd collected would all need to be sold quickly to generate enough cash to cover the lease termination costs and fund her transition to whatever cheaper living situation she could arrange on short notice. Amanda's pride, which had been so carefully maintained through our relationship by my financial support, crumbled as she was forced to list expensive handbags, jewelry, and clothing on resale websites at significant losses, watching her carefully curated image literally being sold piece by piece to cover basic survival expenses. The art collection she'd built with my money, claiming each piece was an investment in our shared future and aesthetic sensibilities, went up for sale at prices far below what we'd originally paid, as Amanda discovered that appreciation in art values required significantly more time and market knowledge than she'd possessed when making those impulsive purchases. Her photography equipment, which had remained largely unused during our relationship despite her constant talk about building a portfolio and establishing herself as a serious artist, was finally put to practical use as she listed cameras, lenses, and lighting equipment to raise quick cash for her transition expenses. The most humiliating aspect of Amanda's situation became apparent when she was forced to call her conservative parents in their suburban hometown, explaining that her sophisticated city lifestyle had suddenly become financially impossible and asking if she could move back into her childhood bedroom while she figured out her next steps. Amanda's parents had never approved of her decision to move to the city for artistic pursuits, preferring that she settle down in their small town with a stable local man and pursue more traditional life goals that didn't involve expensive rent and unpredictable creative income. Their response was predictably conditional. They would allow her to move home temporarily, but only if she agreed to work at her father's insurance office and contribute meaningfully to the household expenses rather than treating their home like a free hotel while she continued pursuing what they considered unrealistic artistic fantasies. The conversation with her parents, which Amanda tearfully recounted to several friends who later shared the details, involved a thorough examination of her financial irresponsibility and poor decision-making, with her father particularly critical of her choice to abandon a relationship with someone who'd been supporting her dreams in favor of chasing excitement with someone who'd clearly had no serious intentions. Amanda's mother expressed disappointment that her daughter had thrown away what appeared to be a stable partnership with a successful professional in favor of romantic drama that had predictably left her emotionally and financially devastated within 24 hours. The small-town insurance office where Amanda's father worked represented everything she tried to escape when she moved to the city: conservative values, predictable routines, modest salaries, and limited opportunities for the kind of artistic expression and sophisticated lifestyle she'd convinced herself she deserved. Working as a receptionist and file clerk in her father's business would mean trading her carefully cultivated urban identity for small-town anonymity, giving up the gallery openings and creative networking events that had made her feel important and cultured in favor of processing insurance claims and answering phones for clients discussing coverage for farm equipment and family automobiles. The transition from her downtown loft with its exposed brick walls and skyline views to her childhood bedroom with its outdated furniture and reminders of her teenage years represented a complete reversal of the progress she'd thought she was making toward the sophisticated life she'd always envisioned for herself. Amanda's social media presence, which had been carefully curated to project an image of artistic sophistication and urban success, would now need to be drastically altered to avoid highlighting the embarrassing reality of her circumstances, as posting about insurance office work and living with her parents would contradict everything she'd been presenting to her followers about her independent creative lifestyle. The designer wardrobe that had been so important to her self-image would be entirely inappropriate for small-town office work, requiring her to invest in conservative professional clothing that reflected her new environment rather than the trendy artistic aesthetic she'd spent so much money and effort developing over the past few years. Her carefully maintained network of city friends and creative contacts would inevitably fade as geographical distance and lifestyle differences made it increasingly difficult to maintain relationships built around shared experiences of gallery openings, expensive restaurant dinners, and cultural events that would no longer be part of her daily reality. The most devastating aspect of Amanda's downfall was the speed with which it unfolded, transforming her from a confident woman pursuing her artistic dreams in an exciting urban environment to someone desperately selling her possessions to afford a humiliating retreat to her parents' suburban home in less than a week. Kyle's complete absence from her life during this crisis provided the most painful confirmation that her decision to prioritize excitement over stability had been based on fantasy rather than reality, as someone who genuinely cared about her well-being would never have disappeared so completely when she needed support and guidance most desperately. The romantic adventure she'd imagined with Kyle, filled with artistic collaboration and exciting travel to photograph exotic locations, revealed itself to have been entirely one-sided, existing only in her imagination while he pursued his own career goals and personal interests without any consideration for her feelings or future plans. Amanda's journal entries, which had been so critical of my supposed inability to provide excitement and spontaneity, now seemed pathetically naive given the reality of Kyle's behavior and the practical consequences of choosing passion over partnership, adventure over stability, and fantasy over the genuine care and support I'd provided consistently throughout our relationship. 6 months after leaving Amanda at the gallery, I was living my best life in ways I hadn't even imagined possible when I was trapped in that suffocating relationship that had consumed so much of my energy and financial resources. I'd moved into a stunning penthouse apartment with panoramic city views, the kind of place I'd always dreamed of but never could afford while subsidizing someone else's lifestyle and unrealistic expectations about what I owed her simply for existing in my space. The apartment was everything our old loft had pretended to be: genuinely sophisticated rather than just expensive, filled with architectural books, design materials, and professional equipment that reflected my actual interests instead of Amanda's superficial attempts at cultural sophistication that had never been backed up by genuine knowledge or passion. My career had exploded in directions I'd never anticipated, starting with the Cultural Center project that had earned recognition from the City Planning Commission and led to referrals for increasingly prestigious assignments that challenged my creative abilities while building my professional reputation throughout the architectural community. Without Amanda's constant criticism and emotional manipulation draining my confidence on a daily basis, I'd rediscovered the passion for innovative design that had originally drawn me to architecture, spending evenings sketching experimental concepts and researching sustainable building techniques that excited me intellectually rather than feeling obligated to rush home for relationship maintenance. The international design contract that Amanda had always discouraged me from pursuing, claiming it would be too stressful and time-consuming for our relationship and that I should prioritize our domestic life over professional ambitions, had materialized into the opportunity of a lifetime when a development firm in Singapore offered me the chance to design a mixed-use complex that would showcase cutting-edge environmental technologies. Amanda had consistently undermined my confidence about taking professional risks, suggesting that I wasn't ready for international work and should focus on safe local projects that wouldn't interfere with our routine or require travel that might take me away from her for extended periods. But without her negative influence poisoning my self-perception, I'd submitted a portfolio that landed me the most exciting and challenging project of my entire career. My social life had transformed completely as I reconnected with colleagues and friends I'd neglected during my relationship, discovering that many of them had noticed Amanda's controlling behavior and manipulative tendencies but had been too polite to comment while we were together, though they'd been quietly concerned about the changes they'd observed in my personality and priorities. I'd started rock climbing at an indoor gym, joined a hiking group that explored scenic trails outside the city on weekends, and even taken up photography as a hobby, finding genuine artistic satisfaction in capturing architectural details and natural landscapes rather than pursuing creative interests primarily to impress someone else or maintain a relationship that required constant emotional labor. Dating had become surprisingly easy and enjoyable once I learned to recognize and avoid the warning signs that Amanda had displayed from the very beginning of our relationship: financial irresponsibility, emotional manipulation, unrealistic lifestyle expectations, and the tendency to view romantic partnerships as transactional arrangements rather than genuine connections between equals who supported each other's growth and independence. The women I met through professional networking events, social activities, and shared interests were accomplished, financially independent, and genuinely interested in building mutual relationships rather than seeking financial security or lifestyle enhancement through someone else's success, creating possibilities for authentic connections based on shared values and genuine compatibility rather than convenience and desperation. My bank account, which had been constantly depleted by Amanda's expensive tastes and financial irresponsibility, now showed steady growth as I invested in my own future and professional development rather than funding someone else's unrealistic lifestyle expectations and artistic fantasies. The stress that had become my normal state during the relationship, constantly worrying about Amanda's emotional reactions, managing her disappointments, and trying to maintain her impossible standards, had completely disappeared, replaced by a calm confidence that came from knowing I was building a life aligned with my own values and goals rather than trying to satisfy someone else's ever-changing demands for attention and validation. I was selecting organic produce at the upscale farmers market near my office on a sunny Saturday morning, enjoying the leisurely weekend routine I'd developed since regaining control of my schedule and priorities, when I spotted a familiar figure hunched over the discount vegetable bins at the far end of the market. Amanda looked exhausted and desperate, her once pristine appearance replaced by the hollow-eyed look of someone who'd been ground down by months of harsh reality and financial struggle that had stripped away all the artificial confidence her previous lifestyle had provided. She was wearing clothes I didn't recognize, conservative, ill-fitting pieces that screamed small-town insurance office rather than the designer outfits she'd once considered essential to her identity and self-worth. Her hair, which had always been professionally styled and highlighted at expensive salons I'd paid for, now hung limp and obviously home-cut, while her complexion showed the stress and poor diet that came from living paycheck to paycheck for the first time in her adult life. I watched her carefully examining bruised apples and wilted lettuce, calculating prices with the kind of desperate attention to budget that she'd never needed to develop during our relationship when I'd covered all the grocery bills and she'd selected items based purely on preference rather than cost. The transformation was so complete that I almost didn't recognize the woman who'd once dismissed my concerns about financial responsibility as boring and controlling, now reduced to shopping for damaged produce while clearly struggling to afford even basic necessities on her insurance office salary. She noticed me before I could decide whether to approach or quietly leave, her face cycling through surprise, shame, hope, and finally desperate determination as she abandoned her sad collection of discount vegetables and walked directly toward me with the purposeful stride of someone who'd been rehearsing this encounter in her mind for months. Her voice was smaller than I remembered, lacking the confident authority she'd once used to dismiss my opinions and redirect conversations toward her own interests and complaints about my allegedly inadequate emotional support and boring lifestyle choices. She told me she'd been hoping to run into me, that she'd driven into the city specifically to visit places where we used to go together, desperately searching for any opportunity to apologize and explain how much she'd learned from the devastating consequences of her choices at the gallery opening and afterward. I listened politely as she described her current living situation with her parents, working at her father's insurance office in a small town where everyone knew about her humiliating retreat from the sophisticated urban life she'd once bragged about on social media to anyone who would listen to her stories of gallery openings and cultural events. She explained that her parents had been treating her like a disappointed teenager rather than an adult, monitoring her spending, questioning her decisions, and constantly reminding her about the stable relationship she'd thrown away for a fantasy that had lasted exactly one evening before revealing itself as completely hollow and manipulative. Amanda described Kyle's complete disappearance from her life, how he'd never responded to her desperate messages and had apparently moved on to his next photography assignment and whatever casual relationships suited his nomadic lifestyle, leaving her to deal with the emotional and financial wreckage of her choices entirely alone. She admitted that the journal entries I'd discovered had been her way of processing feelings she'd been too cowardly to address directly with me, that she'd been building up Kyle as an escape fantasy rather than confronting the real issues in our relationship that stemmed primarily from her own immaturity and unrealistic expectations about what partnerships required from both people involved. The most devastating part of her confession was learning that her parents had been pressuring her to move permanently to their small town, away from the city where she'd built her entire adult identity, because they viewed her urban lifestyle and career aspirations as fundamentally irresponsible and destined for failure unless she accepted their conservative values and traditional expectations about women's roles and priorities. Her father had apparently given her an ultimatum: prove she could support herself independently within the next 3 months, or accept his arrangement for her to marry a local insurance agent's son who'd expressed interest in settling down with someone who understood the importance of family and financial stability over artistic pretensions and urban sophistication. Amanda was clearly terrified of this deadline and the implications of failing to meet her father's expectations, as it would mean abandoning not just her career aspirations but any hope of maintaining the independence she'd once taken for granted when my financial support had made her lifestyle possible without requiring her to develop real job skills or professional discipline. She begged me to consider giving our relationship another chance, promising that she'd learned valuable lessons about gratitude, financial responsibility, and the difference between genuine partnership and the exploitative arrangement she'd created by taking my support for granted while pursuing emotional validation from other men. I could see the genuine desperation in her eyes as she explained that she'd realized Kyle represented everything she thought she wanted but had no substance behind the attractive exterior, while I had represented everything she actually needed but had been too immature and ungrateful to appreciate until it was too late. Her voice cracked as she described watching me from across the market before approaching, seeing how confident and successful I looked, and realizing that I'd thrived without her in ways that proved her presence in my life had been more of a burden than a blessing to my personal and professional development. She admitted that she'd been following my career progress through mutual friends and social media, learning about my international design contract and professional recognition with a mixture of pride and regret that she tried to discourage those very achievements when we were together because they threatened her control over my time and attention. Amanda confessed that she'd been comparing every aspect of her current restricted life to the freedom and opportunities she'd enjoyed during our relationship, finally understanding that my financial support hadn't been controlling or limiting but had actually been the foundation that made her artistic pursuits and urban lifestyle possible in the first place. The irony wasn't lost on either of us that she was now living exactly the kind of small-town, conventional life she'd once mocked and claimed to find suffocating, while I was experiencing the kind of creative and professional freedom she'd claimed to want but had never been willing to work toward independently or support in our partnership. She looked genuinely shocked when I told her about my penthouse apartment, my successful international projects, and the confident, accomplished women I'd been dating who appreciated genuine partnership rather than viewing relationships as financial security arrangements. I could see her calculating the lifestyle she'd given up as I described my recent trip to Singapore for preliminary meetings about the complex design, the kind of international travel and professional recognition she'd once dismissed as unrealistic when I'd mentioned similar aspirations during our relationship. Amanda's face fell as she realized that everything she'd claimed was impossible when we were together had become reality once I'd removed her negative influence and financial drain from my life, proving that her lack of faith in my capabilities had been projection rather than realistic assessment. She began crying openly in the farmer's market as the full scope of her mistakes became undeniable, sobbing about how she'd traded a partnership with someone who was building the successful, creative life she'd always claimed to want for validation from someone who'd viewed her as nothing more than a temporary distraction. I watched her break down with surprising detachment, feeling neither satisfaction nor sympathy but simply observing the natural consequences of choices that had revealed her true character more clearly than any conversation ever could have. Amanda begged me to consider reconciliation, promising that she'd learned to appreciate stability over excitement, that she understood now the difference between genuine love and infatuation, and that she was prepared to be the supportive partner I deserved rather than the emotional and financial burden she'd become. She offered to sign any kind of agreement that would prove her commitment to changing her behavior, to give me complete control over financial decisions, to move wherever my career required, and to support my professional goals without the criticism and manipulation she'd used to undermine my confidence. The desperation in her voice was painful to witness as she listed all the ways she would remake herself to become worthy of another chance, not understanding that the problem hadn't been her specific behaviors but the fundamental selfishness that had made those behaviors inevitable expressions of her character. I realized that Amanda still didn't understand the real issue. She was offering to change her actions but not acknowledging the deeper character flaws that had made our relationship unsustainable, still approaching reconciliation as a transaction where she could exchange promises for the comfortable lifestyle she'd lost rather than demonstrating genuine growth. Her parents had been calling her constantly, she revealed, demanding updates on her job performance and threatening to cut off their minimal support if she didn't show improvement in both her professional responsibilities and her attitude toward the conventional life they'd planned for her. The insurance office job that had once seemed like a temporary humiliation was becoming her permanent reality as her father made it clear that artistic pursuits and urban lifestyle aspirations were luxuries she'd forfeited through her irresponsible choices and would need to earn back through years of proving her reliability. Amanda described her daily routine with defeated resignation that showed how completely her circumstances had broken her spirit, answering phones, filing paperwork, listening to her father's lectures about responsibility and her mother's disappointed sighs about the grandchildren and stable marriage she should be focusing on instead of career fantasies. She admitted that her coworkers, mostly middle-aged women who'd worked in insurance for decades, treated her with a mixture of pity and amusement, seeing her as a spoiled city girl who'd finally learned harsh lessons about real life that should have been obvious to anyone with common sense. The social isolation was perhaps the most difficult aspect of her new situation, as her old friends from the city had stopped reaching out after she'd repeatedly canceled plans due to financial constraints, while her hometown acquaintances remembered the condescending attitude she'd displayed toward their choices before moving to the city to pursue her supposedly superior artistic lifestyle. Amanda confessed that she spent most evenings alone in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by reminders of her teenage years and feeling like a complete failure who'd somehow regressed to dependence on parents she'd once felt superior to because of her urban sophistication and creative aspirations. The dating scene in her small town was particularly depressing, she explained, consisting mainly of men who'd never left the area and had no interest in the cultural experiences that had once been central to her identity, making her realize how much she'd taken for granted during our relationship. I listened to Amanda's desperate pleas with the same calm detachment I'd developed during my months of building a life without her emotional manipulation and financial drain, feeling neither anger nor sympathy but simply recognizing the natural consequences of choices that had revealed her true character more clearly than any argument ever could. When she finally finished her rehearsed speech about lessons learned and promises to change, I told her quietly that she was making the same fundamental mistake she'd always made, focusing on what she could get from me rather than what she could offer to a genuine partnership between equals. I explained that she didn't miss me as a person, but rather missed the lifestyle and emotional management services I'd provided, the financial security that had allowed her to pursue artistic fantasies without developing real skills, and the stability that had made her feel sophisticated without requiring her to actually become sophisticated through her own efforts. Amanda's face crumpled as I continued, telling her that even now, in her supposedly humble state, she was still approaching our interaction transactionally, offering to sign contracts and give me control rather than demonstrating the genuine character development that would make her worthy of the kind of partnership I'd learned to value since leaving her behind. I used her own words from the gallery opening against her with surgical precision, reminding her that she'd told me not to start anything that night, and that I was simply honoring her request by keeping things finished rather than reopening a relationship that had been fundamentally dysfunctional. The irony wasn't lost on either of us that her directive to avoid starting anything had become the foundation for my decision to maintain the boundaries she'd inadvertently established through her own dismissive behavior and emotional betrayal with Kyle. I told her that I'd taken her advice about not starting anything to heart, and had extended that wisdom to every aspect of our former relationship, choosing instead to build something new and authentic with people who appreciated partnership rather than viewing it as a resource extraction opportunity disguised as romance. Amanda began sobbing harder as she realized that her own words were being used to justify my rejection of her reconciliation attempts, that the casual dismissal she'd used to silence my concerns at the gallery had become the very principle preventing her from reclaiming the comfortable life she'd thrown away so carelessly. I explained that I'd learned the difference between someone who loves you and someone who loves what you provide, between a partner who supports your growth and someone who undermines your confidence to maintain control, between genuine compatibility and convenient dependence that masquerades as romantic connection when resources are flowing freely. She desperately offered to prove her transformation by signing legal documents that would give me complete authority over financial decisions, relationship boundaries, and career priorities, not understanding that her willingness to surrender autonomy revealed the same character flaws that had made our original relationship unsustainable. I told Amanda that the problem had never been about control or contracts, but about fundamental respect and genuine care, qualities that couldn't be legislated through agreements or demonstrated through desperate promises made in moments of crisis. As I prepared to walk away to my important meeting about the Singapore project expansion, Amanda made one final, desperate offer that revealed just how completely she misunderstood both the nature of healthy relationships and the reasons our partnership had failed. She suggested that she could sign a relationship contract giving me complete control over every aspect of our life together, that she would essentially become whatever I wanted her to be rather than the person she'd proven herself to be through her choices and behavior patterns over the course of our relationship. I stopped and turned back to her one final time, explaining that I didn't want someone who would surrender their autonomy to reclaim a comfortable lifestyle, that I'd learned to value partnerships with women who brought their own strength, independence, and genuine affection rather than desperate compliance born from financial necessity and social pressure from disapproving parents. I told her that I'd already designed the life I wanted without her input or presence, that every aspect of my personal and professional existence had been carefully planned and executed according to my own values and goals rather than the compromises that had characterized our dysfunctional relationship. The architectural metaphor wasn't lost on either of us. I drafted blueprints for my future that didn't include space for someone who'd proven incapable of contributing meaningfully to the construction of something beautiful and lasting. Amanda's final words as I walked away were a broken plea about how she'd always believed I would wait for her, that she'd somehow assumed my stability meant I would remain available whenever she decided to return from whatever adventures she'd chosen to pursue instead of appreciating what we'd built together. I told her that stability didn't mean stagnation, that reliability didn't mean accepting disrespect, and that her assumption about my availability revealed the same entitled attitude that had made our relationship feel more like a transaction than a genuine partnership. As I walked toward my car to drive to the international design meeting that would finalize details for my Singapore complex project, I felt a profound sense of closure and vindication, knowing that I'd handled the encounter with dignity while making it clear that some bridges, once burned, couldn't be rebuilt regardless of how desperate someone became about the consequences of their destructive choices. The contrast between our situations couldn't have been more stark. I was heading to a meeting that would expand my international career and creative influence, while Amanda was returning to her childhood bedroom and insurance office job that represented everything she'd once claimed to find suffocating. I reflected on how completely our roles had reversed from the gallery opening night when she'd felt confident enough to dismiss and humiliate me in front of my colleagues, to this moment when she was begging for the chance to surrender her autonomy in exchange for financial security she could no longer provide for herself. The months since leaving Amanda had taught me invaluable lessons about recognizing genuine compatibility versus convenient dependence, about the difference between supporting someone's growth and enabling their dysfunction, and about the importance of choosing partners who enhanced rather than diminished my confidence and professional ambitions. I'd learned that the right person would never make me feel like I needed to justify my success or apologize for my stability, that healthy relationships were built on mutual respect and shared values rather than financial arrangements disguised as romantic partnerships. As I drove through the city toward my meeting, passing the gallery where this entire journey had begun, I realized that Amanda's dismissal that night had been the best thing that could have happened to my personal and professional development, freeing me from the emotional labor and financial drain that had been holding me back from achieving my potential. The Singapore project represented everything Amanda had discouraged me from pursuing: international recognition, creative challenges, professional risks that required confidence and ambition rather than the safe, predictable path she'd preferred because it allowed her to maintain control over my time and attention. I thought about the accomplished, confident women I'd been dating since leaving Amanda behind, people who brought their own success and stability to relationships rather than viewing partnerships as opportunities to enhance their lifestyle without contributing meaningfully to shared goals. These women appreciated my planning and attention to detail as signs of care rather than control, valued my professional success as an asset rather than a threat, and offered genuine partnership rather than the emotional manipulation and financial dependence that had characterized my relationship with Amanda. The irony of Amanda's final offer to sign away her autonomy revealed just how fundamentally she misunderstood both the nature of healthy relationships and the specific reasons our partnership had been doomed from the start, even before Kyle's appearance had provided her with an excuse to pursue excitement she'd been fantasizing about for months. I realized that even if I'd been desperate enough to accept her offer of complete submission, the relationship would have failed again because her willingness to surrender her independence revealed the same character weaknesses that had made her unsuitable as a genuine partner: lack of self-respect, inability to contribute meaningfully, and tendency to view relationships as transactional.